We're going to continue our conversation on Chapter 3, the theory of consumer behavior. We're going to continue our conversation discussing indifference curves. When we utilize the idea of a udal, it's called a cardinal measurement, meaning that it's not one that we can compare with the masses. It works well for an individual to know how much utility you would get from hamburgers or hot dogs, but it's harder to tell what society would get from their consumption of the same products. So if we use an indifference curve, we can begin to make societal comparisons. And these are called ordinal measurements, and the graph looks very similar. There's some Greek there about isoutility, or called an indifference curve. I normally call them indifference curves. So as we look at these two indifference curves, we can tell the indifference curve to the left with the M, Q, and R on it. That particular indifference curve yields a utility of about 200 udals. 200 units of satisfaction, whether we're consuming 7 tacos and 1 hamburger, or whether we are consuming 5 tacos and 2 hamburgers, or whether we are consuming 4 tacos and 3 hamburgers. Each one of those will give us the same kind of utility. And if we wanted to increase our overall utility, what would happen is there would be a shift, meaning an outward movement in a indifference curve. And you can see by moving that outward movement, there is an indifference curve of 700. So if you want to get more utility, there must be a shift in your indifference curves. The two indifference curves we see here at 2 and 700, there are also other indifference curves that you can't see that will be to the left, to the inside, and this may be a 100 isoutility curve, and we may have an additional in the center that may be a 500 isoutility curve. There are multiple indifference curves in between. As one would expect, there are so many indifference curves out there. What typically limits people is their scarcity, the resources that they can bring to bear. Let's have a quick conversation about a concept called the slope of the indifference curve, which is measured by the marginal rate of substitution. It's measured by the MRS. The marginal rate of substitution is pretty easy to figure out. If you wanted to get one more on the margin, one additional hamburger, what's the rate at you would substitute tacos? So how many tacos would you give up to get a single additional hamburger? There's an equation there. The marginal rate of substitution equals the change in tacos divided by the change in hamburgers. And I've written that a little bit differently. And so we understand the marginal rate of substitution, it's equal to what we would call the change of tacos. TM is 1 taco, TQ is the change, divided by, it says they're again divided by, the change in hamburgers, HM minus HQ. Let me give you an example that will demonstrate the marginal rate of substitution. Here we have point M on the 200 isoutility curve and point Q on the isoutility curve. And so the idea behind that is if we wanted to increase the number of hamburgers, if we want to increase 1 hamburger, how many tacos would we give up? And it's pretty easy to put in the equation, but I'll do it with you. The marginal rate of substitution is equal to, at point M, 7 tacos, minus by the number of tacos at point Q. And you can see that number of tacos at point Q is 5. 7 minus 5. And that gets divided by the change in hamburgers. So we look at the number of hamburgers we had again at point M, which gives us the 1, and then subtract that by the number of hamburgers we see at point Q, which gives us 2. And when we do all the fancy math, we end up with 7 minus 5, which is 2, divided by 1 minus 2, which is a minus 1, and we can simplify that down to a minus 2. So you can see here, the marginal rate of substitution is 2. Otherwise stated, we recognize that we're willing to give up 2 tacos to get 1 hamburger. The marginal rate of substitution demonstrates that. The marginal rate of substitution is also the slope of the line, but it's still giving up 2 tacos to get 1 hamburger. And if you looked at it again differently, we can see there is a marginal rate of substitution going from point Q to point R. And the same mathematical equation would work out again. It would be the marginal rate of substitution is equal to 5 minus 4 divided by 2 minus 3, which would be 1 divided by a minus 1, which tells us at this juncture we would be willing to give up 1 taco to receive 1 more hamburger. The marginal rate of substitution is how we calculate that. Now, as we're giving up, just remember, in our first example, we talked about giving up 7 tacos to get 5, and 7 tacos and change it to 5. So give up 2 tacos. And when we give up 2 tacos, there's going to be a drop in utility in taco consumption. We will not have as much utility in our taco consumption because we're eating less. However, we also know there's going to be an increase in our utility because of our consumption of hamburgers. And because we've dropped some utility and gained it, just remember and recognize, as we do that, we did not change at all the iso-utility curve. We're still receiving 200 overall utils, but there was a rate of substitution on the margin, or the marginal rate of substitution, to gain 1 more.